you have a basal ganglia, and there seems to be some sort of important, really useful trick that evolution has come up with that relies on this sort of, inhibit until, there's good reason not to mechanism. And I think that could be a profound insight for the decision-making component of artificial agents. I really feel like I re-entered that frame of mind that I had when I started my PhD program, young, bright-eyed. From the time of Benjamin Libet, had those really fascinating experiments that it just totally captured my imagination as an undergrad.
That there is no free will.
Yeah. There is no free will.
Yeah.
Think of that. That is crazy.
It's crazy, right?
It is just super crazy. Yeah.
This is Brain Inspired.
Hello, good people. Today's episode is a little different. My guest is Kyle Dunovan. I am Paul Middlebrooks. Welcome to the show. I say it's different because Kyle is one of many people who originally went the academic route and got his PhD doing computational neuroscience and did a stint as a postdoc, still in academia, but then opted not to pursue a faculty position to start his own lab, and instead got a job in industry in the AI and machine learning world. In his academic life, he focused on the basal ganglia and how its circuitry functions to help us make decisions and withhold our actions. But in his newer life, he finds himself working a lot on natural language processing using modern machine learning and AI techniques. And we talk about all of that, but I say it's a different episode because in between the science discussion, we talk a lot about some of his experiences traversing the academic terrain and transitioning to industry and his thoughts on a range of related topics. Many of you have written to me asking for a conversation like this, so you should have plenty to chew on here. If you're strictly here for the science, this may not be your favorite episode, but don't worry, I'll be back to diving deep into neuroscience and AI topics in upcoming episodes. If you do like this kind of episode, or don't, please let me know. Email paul@braininspired.co. I really enjoyed talking with Kyle, commiserating with him a lot, and I'd be happy to have more shows like this in the future if you want more like this. Quick news. I've mentioned I'm creating a little course related to neuroscience and AI. This thing will be a work in progress. And if you want to stay abreast of the progress, learn when I release early beta versions as I create it, I made a page for it on the website at braininspired.co/course, where you can go and enter your email address. And then as things happen, if they're worthy of sharing, I will email you. If you support the show on Patreon, like those beautiful embodied minds Marika, Alessandro, Paul, and James recently did, thank you guys. If you already support the show or decide to, then there's no need to do anything. I'll be giving you the option to consume and participate as things develop. All right, show notes for this episode are at braininspired.co/podcast/50. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the thoughts, feelings, exasperation, redemption, and insight of Kyle Dunovan. Kyle Dunovan, academia defector. What I would say too many people in academia would call an academic failure. Welcome to the show, man.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Kyle, you got a PhD at the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University, where I got my PhD, actually. Same program. You were just a few years. Right? Yeah, I was at the CNUP and the CNBC.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah, and you stayed on to, I think you got your PhD, or you went into graduate school, I think, right as I was leaving. Or I must have just left.
Yeah, 2011.
Yeah, I'm bad with dates, but it was somewhere around there.
Yeah, I think I remember running into you at an SFN conference. I think. Yeah.
Very good. Anyway, you stayed on to you got your PhD there, and then you stayed on to do a postdoc also in Tim Versteinen's lab. And we are going to talk about your research today, which, I'm familiar with, and also reading it again, because I've been out. I mean, I'm still writing a paper, but made me feel anxious and excited all at once, which was an interesting feeling.
That's the natural feeling that you're supposed to get when you're in the research mode.
I know. I kept having these thoughts like, oh, I've got to do this with my data. Oh, I've got to look for that. So anyway, but these days, you work in, I guess you'd say industry. You work at the Machine Intelligence Research and Applications Lab at Intrepid Corp. And I actually invited you on the show. We'll talk about all this, but for a little perspective, it's maybe going to be a bit of a different kind of show. We'll see. But from someone who's been sort of on both sides of the fence, let's say.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about your research and we'll talk about what you're doing now. And all of this is super interesting. And I also have, all sorts of other kinds of questions.
Yeah.
To start off, I've been interviewing some people who will be giving keynote talks at the Cognitive Computational Neuroscience Conference coming up here. And I noticed you had some papers in last year. Did you attend that conference?
So I was at the sort of inaugural
it was 2 years
conference for CCN. That's right.
The one in Philadelphia. Wait, was it in Philadelphia?
Yeah, it was in Philly. Yeah. And it was I don't know. It was sort of a bittersweet experience for me because I had sort of, I kind of knew that I was jumping ship shortly after. And it was, it was a really cool experience. And I don't know, maybe had it started earlier and I had attended earlier in my career, I don't know. It was pretty exciting. A lot of interesting intersections between machine learning, cognitive science, neuro, very much up my alley.
Yeah. I mean, there's another conference starting that's like that. It's like exciting times. I don't know why I quit.
Yeah. I know. Yeah. It's, I guess, buyer's remorse now.
Sure. So isn't it absurd that so many people in academia call people who leave academia academic failures, and that there's like this stigma associated with leaving the world of academia? I mean, what sort of fucked up insecurity is that?
Yeah, it is a pretty pervasive response to leaving. I think everyone that I know that was sort of in my cohort or, people that I knew that left before me got that reaction from one person or another, when they said they were leaving. I don't know, revisiting this Medium article written by one of your former guests, Mark Humphreys.
Uh-huh.
It's called Academia is the Alternative Career Path. And I remember I forget, maybe a year or two ago when he wrote it, I read it and it was just this gobsmacking epiphany of like, oh my God, like it sort of points out how ludicrous it is for that to be your reaction, given that the numbers are so, dramatically skewed against it, making it from grad student to postdoc, and then even slimmer chance still from postdoc to assistant professor. And then, by the time you get to associate tenured professor, you're talking like, I don't know, 7 to 10% generously.
Yeah.
And it's just to be made to feel like you failed as the 90% of people who don't make it there. It's a little ridiculous, but
you don't feel like a failure, do you?
I do not.
Yeah.
No.
It's a big smile on your face. So the thing is, I have never spoken to anyone who has left academia who hasn't been super happy about the decision, which is
That's right.
It's a 100% rate here.
Yeah, which there's got to be something to that.
Yeah.
I before leaving, but after having made the decision to, not pursue the sort of tenure track application circuit, I, for the first time in a long time, felt like I was really launching into the dark with my eyes closed. Like I did not have the slightest clue as to like where to start. Like, what kind of application do I need to put together? It's, a very different process than what is, required to start, putting together a packet that, makes you competitive in the academic job market.
Right.
And so you don't really receive any training to as to how to get going in this other direction that 90% or whatever of us need to go in.
Yeah.
I fortunately had some pretty close friends who had done this just before me, and had gotten jobs as machine learning engineers or, in that general space.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were, tremendous resource for me, but, still I felt like I was really going out on a limb.
Yeah. We'll get into this a lot more, I hope, coming up here. So we'll take a step back. Let's talk about the times before you were a failure. So
good times.
Yeah. So your most recent research focused on how mechanisms in our basal ganglia, using the action selection circuitry and plasticity that's based on dopamine, could tie together decision-making and learning to carry out the algorithms that we think are important. In decision-making, for instance, the algorithm is the sequential sampling, often modeled with the drift diffusion model, or stochastic accumulators, and the goal is to make a correct choice there. And in learning, there are various reinforcement learning algorithms with the goal of optimizing reward. And you just had recent papers come out this year. So are you still publishing papers and writing? I am, and mine's like 2 years ago. So
yeah, that's another thing that is sort of unique to academia, is that once you leave the job, it sort of follows you around for years and years. After leaving, I moved to DC from Pittsburgh with my girlfriend, and was still sort of remotely working in the lab, sort of tying up projects that we were sort of in the finishing stages of. And there was two, I think. One was a revise and resubmit, and we got that, the revisions done and sent back. And then there was one more that I finished up some analyses here, but I was still applying for jobs at the time. So there was relatively minimal overlap. It just so happened that I had a couple of papers really in the, final stages when I left.
Well, the really in the final stage, there's the key, because they're always, right, I'm doing air quotes, but they're always in the final stages. So.
They've been in the final stages, I think, since I, submitted my dissertation, years, but really in the final stages for those last couple months.
I mean, so I don't know, can you just talk but a little bit more about the work, because it's actually really interesting, and it's straight from your dissertation. So you guys proposed this model that combines the decision-making and the reinforcement learning stuff going on in basal ganglia. It got me all excited again about this stuff.
And anxious.
And anxious. Well, I'm revising for resubmission a paper on response inhibition, because in monkeys, and I recorded neurons, and it's a cross between a response inhibition and a perceptual decision-making task. So it's just so it's right up my alley.
This could actually have been the poster that I saw of yours at SFN. I don't know if that's right.
Probably. Was it a modeling poster?
Yeah. There was sort of attractor networks with some stop signel.
Yes, this was population. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's all coming back to me, because I remember speaking with, and Tim came by the poster too.
Yeah.
Yeah. We talked for a while. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But this was 12 years ago. And that's right. That's the modeling work that I'm still
you're still, it's really in the final stages now.
Really in the final stages now. Every email from my old advisor is, boy, this is really coming together now, isn't it?
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always coming together.
Yeah. So anyway, what basal ganglia? Cool stuff.
Yeah, basal ganglia.
He's rolling his eyes.
I have such a mixed relationship with the basal ganglia. It's one of those, it's this fascinating but still totally mysterious, ubiquitously involved network in the brain. I mean, it's in essentially every vertebrate species has some homologue of the basal ganglia, and in all of those species, it receives I think conservatively, like 90% of cortex sends inputs to, the striatum and maybe the subthalamic nucleus. And so it's this, like incredibly important network. It's also, think of some, neurological ailment or disease, and it's basal ganglia is probably involved, or the dysfunction of it is probably involved. And it also seems to be involved in, everything from motor control, planning, reinforcement learning, decision making, basic inhibitory control. So it's really a challenging, it's sort of a tall order to pin down really, what is it responsible for? And, if it is indeed responsible for that thing, how does it carry out the information processing steps? And, a lot of my earlier research sort of, in grad school was more sort of on the cognitive algorithm side, the information processing recipe, if you will, for, basic kinds of perceptual and value-based decision-making, as well as inhibitory control. And that work sort of explored, okay, how could we start putting these, functions together, learning and decision-making.
Functions that have to be together at some point.
That's right, yeah. At some point, there has to be a nexus where you learn to control your decisions, learn to inhibit unwanted behaviors. And so traditionally, these have sort of been independent streams of research. And so it was really fun to start sort of, patching together these formal computational models that have been used for a long time in cognitive science. In the postdoc, I started working with a mathematician, Jonathan Rubin, at the University of Pittsburgh. And he had collaborations with Xiaoxing Wang, who has done this very biologically detailed and sophisticated modeling work on basal ganglia. And so we sort of picked up where one of Jonathan Rubin and Xiaoxing's previous projects had left off. They had this really elaborate spiking neural network of cortex, basal ganglia, and the thalamus. And we started exploring, okay, what if instead of just doing the neural network modeling, we sort of treated that model like a participant, and we used these models from cognitive science to try to understand what algorithm it was carrying out, and sort of what parameters of that cognitive algorithm were modulated when we tinkered or played with some of the bells and whistles in the neural network. So we were doing this experiment in the context of a value-based decision-making task where the network makes a two alternative forced choice decision, and then it gets some feedback, and there's some dopaminergic error signal telling it, it's right or wrong, and that modulated the weights of these cortex to striatum connections, and then it would proceed to the next decision and repeat. And then over the course of many decisions, we now had sort of a time course of okay, well, you're seeing changes in behavior. If we fit the cognitive model to the network's behavior, what happened to the algorithm? What was that feedback responsible for, and how did the learning affect the sort of behavioral algorithm for how it treated new evidence and how it converted that new evidence into a decision and got better at achieving its goal of maximizing reward.
Yeah, this is really nice work. I mean, the paper you're referring to, I guess, is the most recent paper. Is that the PLOS paper with Jonathan Rubin and Tim? I'll link to it in the show notes. I'll link to the whole series of these papers. I mean, it's really exciting work being done in the basal ganglia these days. So I've talked a lot about the hippocampus. I've had a lot of guests who talk about and work on the hippocampus, and of course, the neocortex is everyone's favorite part of the brain. But I had Rafael Bogach on the show, and he's done a lot of the basal ganglia optimization work that you guys refer to a lot.
Yeah.
But What do you think? Is the AI world neglecting the basal ganglia as a source of inspiration beyond? So, I mean, there's the classic dopamine and reinforcement learning story, and that's kind of
Sure.
where it stops with AI. And
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Reinforcement learning, as sort of like a class or category of computational models, has been, profoundly influential. Like, if you go back to just 2014, the DeepMind AlphaGo
yep,
success sort of kicked off the reinforcement learning
that's right.
frenzy. But yeah, I think there is something special and unique about the architecture of the basal ganglia that is not present in any of these artificial agents. And one unique aspect of this network is that if you think intuitively about like how you behave and act in the world, you sort of think about doing stuff. Like in order to, move your arm, you need to move your arm. But really what you need to do is remove this dramatic, profound, sustained inhibition of the arm, flexor, extensor muscles, which the basal ganglia is sort of exerting all the time. It's always, preventing output until you've sort of received enough sensory input or some internal motivation enough to release it.
To overcome it, yeah. So
That's
you're
right,
referring
yeah.
to this indirect pathway in the basal ganglia, which we will not get into the
Yeah, sure.
the actual anatomy of it, but yeah, that it's kind of constantly on inhibiting actions, and then you really have to overcome it with a more what's called the direct pathway in the basal ganglia.
Yeah, this disinhibition, and so there is this remarkable finding that if you are a member of a vertebrate species, you have a basal ganglia, and there seems to be some sort of important, really useful trick that evolution has come up with that relies on this sort of, inhibit until there's good reason not to mechanism. And I think that could be a profound insight for the decision-making component of artificial agents, right? Like you're sort of applying a threshold by default, and you're sort of requiring this burden of evidence in order to execute a decision. Otherwise, the agent sort of isn't allowed to.
Right. It's like you kind of think of a decision as starting from zero, right? And then you think, oh, okay, now if I get enough evidence for this thing, I'm going to do that. But, really what you're saying is that the basal ganglia ensures that we start at some level that then there's a lot of give and take that can go on.
Yeah, it's like you're starting negative. And you have to get positive, or you have to sort of like, pass that, like get out of the red zone in order to make a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if, I'm just, thinking off the cuff here. So I just interviewed Raya Hadsel, who's a robotics person at DeepMind, and she does a lot of deep reinforcement learning in the robotics world. And I wonder if something like the basal ganglia functioning is going to become more important when there is more embodiment in the AI world, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, you could pretty easily imagine the incentive for like, making sure a robot is really, really sure before it hauls off and does something in the real world, right? Like there's actual like physical consequences to our fragile human bodies when we're operating amongst, really powerful mechanic bodies.
Yeah. Well, you could, it's an important mechanism as well. Look, so we're talking about the decision making and essentially, well, I guess we're talking about it both, because you're inhibiting a response or deciding to respond or overcoming the inhibition to a response, but then you're also choosing which response to make. But that it's also valuable in non-embodied systems, of course, just making decisions or not in a.
That's right. Yeah.
Totally, but it might just become more apparent. So I'm sort of picturing like, when is the basal ganglia going to get its due in AI,
Yeah. It's sort of funny because reinforcement learning has really taken the AI world by storm. But, if you go just, one department to the left, like you're in neuroscience, like the first stop in reinforcement learning in a neuroscience department is the basal ganglia, right? It's sort of the most famous or infamous, depending on who you ask, circuit for controlling that algorithm, that learning algorithm. Yeah, so I find it a little unusual that it hasn't, I don't know, been picked up or experimented with. We had sort of grand plans to collaborate with some roboticists at CMU on developing some differentiable architecture to mimic some of the sort of direct indirect pathway anatomy in an artificial agent. It never really took off, but maybe it's just a very hard problem and people have tried unsuccessfully, and all that work has just been shelved.
Yeah.
But I guess we'll never know.
Well, we will know. Hopefully we'll know. I mean, everyone's interested in the cortex, and there's this, like I said, the hippocampus is really hot right now, but then you have these other regions, and of course, people are going to talk about amygdala soon and fear and emotion. But and then there's the cerebellum in the back of the head too, and I just interviewed Philip Alvelda, and these haven't been aired yet, and he's really interested in the cerebellum's role in prediction and all this, so there's just so many different avenues to go down here.
Right. Yeah. This was another bittersweet aspect of leaving neuroscience when I did, which is that I really feel like in the last, 2 to 5 years, somewhat gradually, people have really started to challenge and question some of the most fundamental assumptions that a lot of the famous findings that we sort of think about in the history of neuroscience are based on. And now thinking about what the relevant unit of measuring functional neural activity is. Should we be focusing on single neurons, or should we be talking about population codes? Is it useful to measure an average firing rate over some amount of time?
Yes, I'm speaking to my reviewers. Yes, it's useful. Yes. No, it's not useful, but we do it.
Yeah, we do. And so I think people like Conrad Cording and Jonathan Pillow and John Sorensis have, in their own particular domains where they have pet peeves, whether that be methodological or the measurement techniques that are used, or on the analytical side, or just the theoretical side of what we should be asking. A lot of these people have been really fun to watch and read and listen to. And I've found that to be refreshing.
Yeah. So what was it that made you really decide that it was time to move on?
Yeah, I found myself in the 90% of people who just, I did not really.
Well, were you doing job search or?
No, so I was sort of coming to a natural conclusion of my postdoc in Tim's lab.
Yeah. This is going to all sound very familiar to me, I'm afraid. So go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I was finishing up projects and thinking about next steps. And the original plan was, I think, I started thinking okay, I'm going to start putting together an academic job packet of, here's a packet of my teaching experience and student reviews of my teaching and my research and extracurricular stuff and, everything that sort of goes into a personal statement and everything.
So you were starting. Yeah.
Well, we're thinking about it at least. And then I sort of, I thought, okay, well, maybe industry wouldn't be so bad. And that idea sort of crept into my head. And then I thought, okay, maybe I'll just do a split. I'll apply to some industry and some academic positions and just see how it all shakes out. And then that turned into wow, I am going to be grinding to get this academic job, application into, a ton of places because the hit rate is going to be so low.
Yeah.
And I'm probably not going to make it this round anyway. I really felt like I probably wouldn't get any invitations to give a job talk just because I don't have a Nature Neuro paper. And
the field was crowded. There was a backup too at that time.
Super crowded.
Yeah.
And, there are people who are just going to be a lot more filled out in their CV than I was going to be. And I, came to that realization, and I thought, well, I might as well just apply on the industry side and see how that goes, because I'd always been curious about it. Working in that space, I'd heard from several friends that they were having the times of their lives doing whatever they were doing. And so, but it was scary for sure. I was very nervous the whole time.
You also came, so I think that you and I share this in common. Correct me if I'm wrong, but did you have maybe a somewhat of a chip on your shoulder that was driving you because of like how you managed to get into grad, like how you had to fight? Maybe I don't know if you had to fight, but
so I got really lucky getting into grad school. I think I was super green. I also, I didn't have a ton of research experience. Most people who ended up getting into grad school knew a professor who knew somebody at Pitt, and that person recognized this person's name, and
it's just academia is just like industry. It's all about who you know. It's all political
politics.
Such bullshit.
Which is something you really learn after going through it, because I don't know why people think about it, or if it's portrayed this way, or it's just an erroneous assumption that somehow it's cordoned off from all of that nonsense. But it is, if anything,
more
inundated with it.
It's a hard pill to swallow, that realization.
Yeah. So I don't know. It ricochets you in a way that leaves you feeling pretty jaded about how, I don't know, it feels like it sort of fails to live up to what it's sold to you as, which is this, very like a meritocracy, basically, that really is just as susceptible to prestige and the politics of the rest of the world.
That was also, there are lots of reasons, and I don't need to tell my story here, but that was one of the things that really hit me. It's like, oh, that's awful. Do I really want to play this game and constantly push against this? And the answer was no. That clearly for me, that answer was no.
That's right. Yeah.
But that was one factor for me. But
one thing I wanted to make sure that I said here was that I really loved my job. Yeah. Like I really like doing research. I still find questions about the brain absolutely fascinating, because they are. Like, it's just, it was, I was really lucky to get to spend that much time focusing on, like, solely focusing on something that was really, truly just intrinsically fascinating. But I don't think that, I feel like I entered the program, my training and the pipeline for what I thought was to become a lifetime academic. And I don't feel like academia held up its end of the bargain.
Oh, well said.
I think a lot of grad students enter a PhD program. They spend, some of them, 60 hours a week grinding for very little pay, and trying to live up to these sort of monstrous expectations of how they should spend their time, and just spreading themselves way too thin, doing the bare minimum of what either their advisor or their program expects of them. And the underlying assumption that justifies all of that work is that this is helping me move myself along through the ranks of academia, and it will contribute to my success in getting a tenure track job or whatever they want to do. And for most people, that assumption is just false. It's a false assumption that the people who did make it in academia, they're, the people who preceded these students and are responsible for training them, they benefit from that false assumption and in most cases, or in my experience, those programs are more than happy to let these students sort of operate under this false assumption because it is cheap expert labor.
It is, yeah, that sure is. Before we move on, so I interrupted you because I just want to talk about me, right? So, but you said you got lucky because of maybe you knew someone, but
Sure.
you're a dropout, right?
Well, yeah. So I was a pretty miserable high school student, and then I had aspirations to be a famous metal guitarist.
Nice.
I really felt like my hardcore band in Western Nebraska was on the come up, so I stayed and went to community college in my hometown. And
in the band, you were in the band?
Yeah, that's right.
What were you guys
eventually called? Oh man, we were called. I was in a lot of bands, but okay. I think the one at that time was a Deadwood Calamity. Little play on words. Deadwood, South Dakota, Calamity Jane.
Oh, nice. Okay.
We thought we were pretty cool.
Went over my head, but yeah, it sounds pretty cool.
Anyway, that was my reason for staying in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and going to Western Nebraska Community College, which I did not graduate from. I think I rounded that out with a C in Algebra 2 and maybe a C plus in Intro to Education.
Right. Yeah.
And then was able to get into state college in Omaha, Nebraska, UNO there. I was not the sort of high flying straight A student who was always destined for the ivory towers by any means. I had a late intellectual blooming where I got introduced to neuroscience through philosophy of mind. This really cool class called Limits of Consciousness. And the professor was just this profound influence on me, and he really took an interest in me because he saw that I was interested in the class.
Yeah.
I think after the first class, I went to the registrar's office and changed my major to neuroscience, and it was pretty much that was it for me. I just really launched into it. Then after having that really spontaneous shift in my interests and priorities, I did well in school, completing that major, and had some really awesome advisors write me letters of rec and stuff.
Oh yeah, that helped me too.
Yeah, that was a big one for me.
I root for guys like you because that's guys like me, guys and gals like me, right? That we're, I screwed myself over innumerable ways, and it's a minor miracle that I got into grad schools.
Yeah, I think for a long time, I think a lot of people have this assumption that to be an academic or a scientist or a researcher that you have to be really smart. And
but look at us, huh?
Yeah, exactly. We're very dumb, and we're doing, we're still doing science.
Yeah.
But I really think that is one of the saddest misconceptions about science is that you have to be this disaffected, socially aloof, brilliant egghead. And really, I've seen a lot of scientists who were definitely, intellectually superior to everyone else in the room, but really we're not cut out to be good scientists. Mm-hmm. And there were people who were, fell well below them on the sort of, intellectual ladder, but were curious, driven, motivated, really, really interested in asking deep scientific questions and then doing the legwork to get a reasonable answer that really exceeded those quote unquote brilliant peers of theirs.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of my lessons, one of the things I learned, I suppose, was that you don't have to be brilliant to get a PhD. And what a PhD means is that you are probably above average intelligence, but it means that you worked really hard and you have some grit and there was some drive, right? Because
Yeah.
it seems like if you just continue working hard, you're going to get the PhD. So to me, it's
Yeah.
like not magical. It takes the magic away from the PhD.
Yeah, getting the PhD definitely,
Yeah.
I don't know, it lifts that spell, so to speak. Like it really, you see it as an indication of work ethic much more than, intellectual brawn.
Yeah, which is I respect. So
Absolutely, yeah. And I think in carrying out the process, you do develop a deep appreciation for work ethic over a lot of other things.
Yes.
And things like, I think, curiosity and motivation, the ability to self-motivate and follow through is a big deal, because without that, I mean, you can be really, really smart and not capable of finishing anything, and you're not worth much as an expert at that point.
Yeah. I mean, at least in experimental neuroscience, I suppose. I shouldn't speak for all PhD efforts, but I have the feeling that it generalizes as strong in me. So
I will say that I'm not envious of. I think you have a background in electrophys.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about it. It depresses me.
No, that is. I'm under no illusions that my PhD was as hard as somebody who had to train monkeys to do human tasks.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if hard is the word, but again, it's persistence and, Don't make me cry here, Kyle. Let's move on.
Yeah.
So okay. So you got into grad school and you worked hard and stuff, and you loved your job.
I did. Yeah.
We have all had scientific moments, right? Like that special, like, oh, the really like this, I'm going to remember this. Can you give me an example of a scientific moment that you've had?
Yeah, I think I've had a few that fall into some different categories. One was mentoring. So like when I got to sort of late grad student postdoc phase, I had a couple like really, really bright undergraduate mentees that would sort of week after week come to our meetings with progress or
impressive.
Like questions that were, I mean, both of the students I'm thinking of were, I mean, way, way, way smarter than I was. So it was sort of a mentoring challenge to like, how do I like sort of steer these, students without getting in their way? Like, how do I contribute in ways that they will benefit from without, and I needed to remind myself not to pretend that I was smarter than them. And so it was a real pleasure getting to get to know these really bright kids and help them learn how to do good science within the confines and constraints of scientific, institutions. And they are, both of them are in grad school now and doing really interesting work. So those interactions were things I really valued a lot.
The people, yeah.
And I don't know, I think you get so jaded by the end of a PhD that I think for me anyway, it took that sort of naive, childlike wonder of a mentee to like get me, excited again about the process. I know it's so important.
You got to get your kicks through other people.
Got to get my kicks. Yeah. No, it was, I don't know. It was exactly what I needed at the time. And it was a nice, healthy reminder that it wasn't all so broken, that there was like really smart people who were going through the system with the best of intentions to do really good, solid scientific work and, had an ethical head on their shoulders. So it was rewarding and refreshing and a good reminder that science wasn't totally broken.
Which you knew in your heart of hearts.
Deep down, but I needed just a little pick me up. But, I also had, personal scientific moments, as you say. Like, I think, again, this was early postdoc. I can't remember if somebody recommended the article to me or I was reading it for journal club or something, but I was exposed to some of Eve Marder's work on underdeterminacy in neural circuits. So this phenomenon of a complex system being capable of producing more or less the same output under different parametric regimes. So like a simple example is a single neuron, let's say, that has sodium and potassium channels, and you're trying to fit those two free parameters, let's say sodium conductance and potassium conductance, based on, the neuron, how well the neuron's firing rate matches some data. But there are multiple different pairs of values that sodium and potassium conductance can take on that all lead to the exact same firing rate. So how do you know when you fit that model to some empirical firing rate data that the two values that you ended up with are, good values for what the system has in the real world, right? So it's this sometimes called slackness or sloppiness in neural systems.
Multiple realizability, I believe it goes by that name as well.
That's right. And so it totally changed how I looked at neuroscience research and really shaped how I digested other papers that I was reading. Like, is this this model, is this model too complex for the sort of limited amount of data that it's being informed by or fit to? So I think I sort of viewed a lot of Eve Marder's work in that domain as sort of like meta research, sort of like guidelines or like limits or constraints on like what you could really say in the field of theoretical neuroscience, where you are really dealing with the most complex system that we know about. And the current approaches just don't really seem to be respecting that complexity in a way that I thought was necessary. And then, so that insight was really profound. I think Eve Marder's work is just brilliant across the board. And she works on crabs. She's has this remarkable ability to pull out these really broad, sweeping insights that apply to the, whole field of neuroscience and all it encompasses, from this dramatic gastric ganglion of crustaceans. I just think she's brilliant.
There's hope there too for everyone, because there's still an infinite amount of room to make progress in these sorts of things. So. Yeah,
for sure. And like I said, I think that some of those important questions are starting to get asked, and the appropriate challenges are starting to be lodged, against some of the status quo methods that we've relied on for a while that may not be really telling us what we think it's telling us.
In some sense, though, neuroscience really is a young field in that, people just, 10, 20 years ago were just getting like single neuron responses, right? And that was, you spent 6 months doing this, and then you take a victory lap, and all you have to do is like record one cell and then sort of characterize it, and you'd have these classic papers.
Yeah, no, I know. And even when I came into grad school, I remember having lunch with a pretty high-profile scientist in the CNBC at the time, and they told me that if you weren't measuring single neuron activity, that you weren't doing real neuroscience. And that really stuck with me. I know who that was.
I know who that was.
I bet you know too. It really left a bitter taste in my mouth, and I want to think in my heart that he's sort of had a coming to Jesus moment in the past couple of years, but I think that might be giving him too much credit.
I don't know if senility maybe that is the coming to Jesus moment that he needs. Yeah. But I respect that person, actually. But
yeah, teach their own.
Another thing I realized going through and getting a PhD, you get your PhD and you're supposed to know something, but it seems like the more you learn, the less you actually know. And there are lots of things that I wish I had known going in to graduate school, for instance.
Yeah.
I mean, is there something that comes to mind that you wish you'd known going into neuroscience research?
I wish that I had known that some of the assumptions weren't gospel. Like some of everybody sort of took for granted shouldn't actually be taken for granted. And I think that would free up a lot of interesting research questions to be explored. But I think in the last 5 years, there's been sort of some very highly respected people in the field coming forward and saying, like, we really got to reevaluate the question set. And I wish that had happened a little bit earlier.
It does feel like that's a very recent phenomenon, but I'm sure it's not, because all the groundwork was already there for that to happen.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on, neuroscience is such a broad, like catch-all field. There's really so many subdisciplines where it's probably more true in some subdisciplines of the larger field where some of the basic assumptions were more wrong and more recently challenged, whereas other subfields might have had an earlier sort of realization that they needed to reevaluate. But I think at least in terms of computational neuroscience and decision and learning questions within that domain have gotten a real rejuvenation, just in terms of like what's fair game in terms of how to recast the modeling enterprise and like what constitutes a model. I think the new trend of applying deep neural networks to empirical questions about neural systems is really interesting. I think you had Dan Yammons on the podcast, and he was part of a panel at the first CCN conference, and I think the question that these three panelists were tasked with answering in their own unique way was, what would a good model of the brain look like? Like what would that even look like, right? Because as soon as you build a really, like a high fidelity model of the brain, now you've got a system that is as complex as the system that you're trying to glean insights about.
Yeah.
So it's like this, it's this catch-22 that the closer you get to the system, the less tractable that model system is to answer your questions. And so Dan Yammons had this, like, what I thought was a really brilliant argument that what we currently do is we have these toy tasks for our models to solve, like a 2 alternative forced choice task.
Yeah.
It's a far cry from anything we really experience in the real world. We're usually talking about 1 or 2 relevant feature dimensions on which the agent is supposed to base their decision, all that stuff.
Sure.
It's incredibly, sterilized.
Well, it's abstracted. You have to. A more optimistic way of saying that would be it's abstracted, and
we've certainly learned, something using this approach. But I do think that we're reaching a point where we've extracted a lot of information about the basic, mechanisms of these simple behaviors, but to scale up to something more interesting and generalizable, it's going to require a slightly different approach and, maybe a dramatically different approach. And Dan Yammons' argument was that, well, okay, if you want to test a model at scale, you need a more complex task. And one benefit that comes from that is that the more complex the task, the harder it is to solve, the fewer strategies there are available to solve that task. And so if you build a complex, let's say, a neural network based agent, and you ask it to solve a really complex task, you can say something very explicit about the strategy it used to solve it, if it did in fact find a solution. And you can also maybe not know everything about the strategy, the information processing, the sort of fine-grained relationship between structure and function, but you can start to glean insights about what's necessary in terms of an architecture in order to, implement a particular information processing strategy. And you can, instead of like optimizing over different values of a parameter, you can start optimizing over different different architectures of the network. So throw in different activation units, throw in different connection motifs, and see how that changes the efficacy of the agent in solving the task. So I thought that was a refreshing perspective, flipping the problem on its head in a way that felt like you could really pull out some useful information, and you could do it in a way that was not so abstracted or oversimplified.
Yeah. You talked about buyer's remorse earlier. And,
yeah.
In some sense, what I'm seeing going on now, and I know I can see the way that you're talking about these things, you think, oh, this is exciting stuff, and it is exciting stuff. And I think, man, if I could start over, how would I proceed, And I actually get a lot of the feedback I get on the show is, people say, oh, I like your show, yada, yada, whatever. But please, like, I need advice that people want to hear. Like, how should I proceed? How should I go about doing this? Like, how do I get so that I'm working on neuroscience and AI? So if you were going to start over right now, how would you lay it out for yourself?
Yeah, I would take more computer science. I don't think it's certainly not necessary to be a precocious math whiz or computer science nerd. Like I didn't start programming until I was in grad school, and I actually have like a really embarrassingly low level of formal math education. And, like I was sort of told from a pretty young age that I was not a math person, and I was really bad at it. And so I sort of operated under that assumption for a really long time. But when I was in grad school, I had a lot of free time in my earlier like stages of training that I knew that I really was interested in computational approaches, whatever, that interest meant at the time. It was kind of superficial, but I knew I really wanted to, I don't know, try my hand at it. And so I spent a lot of time reading about Bayesian statistics, and then sort of tinkering around with MATLAB, and then I switched to Python, and then that really just hooked me. Yeah. I just totally fell in love with I don't know, that
coding?
work. That work was fun. Yeah, coding was a good time, and learning to do it was a pretty rewarding experience. Right? You succeed or you fail. Usually you fail a lot and then you succeed, but it's this sort of in the weeds tinkering until it works, and that's fun once it pays off.
But there's quicker feedback, I feel like, in coding than there is in research, which helps.
There is, yeah. It is a way to bootstrap some quick feedback into your life. If part of your work in doing neuroscience research involves coding, that is, a clear and frequent success or fail signal that if there are people that haven't gone to grad school yet listening to this, just trust me, you yearn for feedback in a way that you never knew you could. You go, without sort of forcing something like that into your life, you could go like, months, if not years, without really any clear guidance from the world around you.
Just to play devil's advocate, I wonder if it's not swinging too far into the computer science direction these days, where someone might be more valuable or as valuable, or have a different kind of value if they do go the sort of the more neuroscience biology route. I wouldn't do that either, but
yeah, I mean, I really think that that's an irreplaceable part of doing neuroscience research. You have to have people who are experts in collecting empirical data, in running sound experiments and designing them, and that is a whole other skill set that is, requires just as much rigorous training and attention to detail. And it can't be taken for granted. Absolutely. And you certainly don't need to be a coding genius to do useful neuroscience research. I feel really strongly about that. I do think that as the computational abilities continue evolving, right? Just the scale of our computing and analytics ability right now is something that should be taken advantage of in academia in a way that I think in a lot of psychology and biomedical, including neuroscience programs, at least during the graduate training it's not taught, it's not emphasized. And I think academia is going to pay a price for neglecting it. But to answer your question, no, I think, the wet lab work is just as necessary as it always has been.
Everything is necessary. There's just too much to do. One of the things I appreciate about the computer science tract as well is that I think that it's really good practice for thinking at the algorithmic level, let's say, between the higher computational level and the lower implementation level. And I feel like that's been of value. It's maybe ushered in this new sort of approach that has been sweeping through the neuroscience AI world.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I spent a lot of my time. That's really where I lived intellectually throughout most of my, academic research life.
Well, that's why I'm reading your stuff and I'm thinking, oh, it's so cool. It's because I'm more on the mechanism implementation, more so. Although I deal with the modeling and all that stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, it really forces you to wrestle with the trade-offs at each of those levels. And, on the other side of that coin, to really value what, each of those sort of, I have a friend who is now also, he's a postdoc or research scientist or something working with Tim. And he's a MAR denialist. So you just, I think mostly just to piss me off, but
just for clarity, we're speaking about David Marr and Tommaso Poggio's levels of analysis, where you have different ways of approach, different levels of understanding, and from the implementation, the meat of the brain, figuring out how the neurons work, through the algorithmic level, where you propose the steps that are necessary, to then the computational level, which is the actual goal of the task, let's say. But that's a very, very poorly stated.
No. I mean, that's the gist of it. I think I find that such a useful, if albeit imperfect and coarse way of framing a lot of problems in neuroscience, because you are inherently up against a system that is, we are interested in the more high level abstract components of whatever the implementation level is. The output is of interest, and really the computational goal, it informs the, how we are going to probe the system for possible mechanisms that could be performing, whatever algorithmic steps are necessary to complete that goal. And no, it's not a hard truth that, these levels of analysis exist or should be adhered to rigidly or anything. It's a continuum, right? There are ways that you could cast the same question at any different point, along that continuum. But I do think it's a useful construct for framing questions very precisely and setting out scientific goals for yourself, whether it's in the theoretical modeling space or empirically. Having those different levels in the back of your mind have always been helpful in clarifying what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I agree. And you were talking about, are we even asking the right questions? I had that just even before graduate school as a technician in a lab, and we were learning about plasticity. And I actually asked in the class, which I was, I wasn't officially in the class. I asked, I don't remember the question, but I suggested that we were asking the wrong questions. And the professor, who was my boss, actually, he was like, what do you think the right questions are? I don't know, man.
I don't know.
But one of the things that I love too about, so I really appreciate approaching it from these different levels. And one of the things I love thinking about is that all of these things that are becoming really popular right now in reinforcement learning and the way to think about them, they're probably all wrong. And
Yeah.
But they're so
Yeah.
useful, and it's just another step in the
No,
learning.
I mean, that's the adage, right? You learn as wrong, and that's just something you should accept. But some are useful, and you should strive for that instead. Like if you are setting out to construct or develop the right model that is somehow capital T true, you will become a zealot, and you will, martyr yourself for the cause, and it will be to the detriment of, the scientific literature that you're contributing to if you're just hell-bent on proving the veracity of your likely pigeonholed idea. But if you set out to build useful models, usually what I find is that engenders a kind of mentality where people set out to, they publish on a model, and then they, as fast as they can, turn around a publication to show how it was wrong and how they change it, right? And that is useful. I find that really useful.
It's very useful, and you have to publish. So you
Yeah.
you can't just not publish it.
That's right, yeah.
How do you, how does one escape or prevent academic burnout? This is something I faced, and it contributed to my exit.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think in order to really successfully avoid getting burned out in academia, you are going to face a lot of friction, because in order to do that, to be like sane and have like a reasonable work-life balance, you have to buck some of the expectations that the institution holds of you. And, you could spread yourself way too thin just living up to the bare minimum expectations. And so you have to learn how to say no. You have to set out clear expectations yourself for what you're willing to do, when you're willing to do it, what kind of work schedule you feel comfortable having. I think there's a lot of uncomfortable conversations you will likely need to have with
that are worth it.
Yeah, that are absolutely worth it, because that could be the difference between you soldiering on and staying in a job that is a great job and is something that a lot of people love to do, but sort of reach that point where they sort of graduate out of academia, where there's just no room for them anymore. And it's challenging not to get burned out.
There's actually a whole suite. I think there's maybe 5 or 6 books I have on a list now that I wish I had read as a kid. Although they probably wouldn't have sunk in, but before going to graduate school, before getting into research, that are like, one of the books is called Essentialism, and one of the tenets is to do like what's essential. And part of that is setting boundaries and saying no and being steadfast about it. And if I had known this sort of stuff that helps with your own A, productivity, B, just knowing what to focus on, when, what's important, that sort of stuff that stuff is what I feel like would have been a true game changer for me going in.
Absolutely. And like you mentioned productivity, like I think, a lot of people get wrapped up in this. I don't know. They sort of get blinders on, and they think, okay, well, I'm just going to stay here until this works. I can't tell you how many times I literally spent the night in the lab just like, I don't know. I mean, hounding on this code, to like just twisting its arm every which way. And most times I would, fail. I would go home in the morning. I would sleep. I would wake up at some ungodly, afternoon hour. I would go back to the problem and I would get it to work in an hour.
Oh,
and
I know.
Had I just gone home at 5.
Had you just known how the brain works before,
that's right.
That's how learning works,
That's
it's
right.
So
if
interesting.
I could have just taken a page out of my own book.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's a big problem too. And these are things that I learned by the time I left academia is when I felt like, oh, okay, now I could start academia and be okay.
Yeah. No, I think, maybe this is out of left field, but for most of the students that I mentored or helped to mentor, my advice to them was take a year at least. Like take a year and really figure out if this is one necessary for what you want to do. And if it is, like, be selective, like figure out where you want to go, find a program that you feel like you fit into. I really took a lot of that stuff for granted. I was just like, if I get into grad school, I'll be super lucky. And if I don't, then I'll just go playing guitar somewhere. Like I don't know. Like I really didn't pay attention to a lot of what I now see as the relevant dimensions of a program or a lab that was going to be helpful in getting me to where I wanted to go. Yeah. And, I ended up working with people who I respect and I learned an immeasurable amount from. But, when I was going into my PhD, I really had no idea what I was doing. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had no idea what I was in for once I got there. And anything somebody told me, I was just like, well, I guess I better do that because you're a low person on the totem pole. Yeah. Like you have no idea. You are suffering from what is just the worst case of imposter syndrome. Like, and you just think you're lucky to be there. So you better, like save face and, for another week until you're found out. So
that's right. That's right.
I would advise, any, new or aspiring, PhD neuroscientists to know that they're an adult and they can say no. It's, that you are not, this isn't like indentured servitude, or it shouldn't be. And so I think if you push back and you hold your ground, most people might be uncomfortable with it, but they will respect it ultimately, and you're better off for it. So,
on the other hand, I've had people write in and say that they need the sort of heavy-handed, they need to please their advisor. And that's something that they thrive on, that's not me, so I can't really speak to that. But I know that type of person.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, I've used that as a reward signal before. I find value in being valued. And so I can sympathize with that perspective.
Sure.
But I think, in academia, it can become an unhealthy learning signal. It can really, I've seen people just destroyed one day and on cloud nine the next because of two different conversations they had with their advisor back to back. And it was like, if you're living and dying on the opinion of somebody who's, this volatile, like you really need to step back and get some perspective, because it's just not a healthy, especially for the the longevity of a PhD program. That's an untenable situation, just emotionally.
Yeah, don't keep a noose around the office. So, what
that's good advice.
What do you think about the idea of and I'm sorry, I know I could just talk about this all day, so I'm sorry.
I could too, and that's okay.
What do you think of the idea of enforcing something like a regular sabbatical type not getaway, but something where, so in your graduate, I'm thinking of graduate school and beyond, but you're so focused and you get so narrowly focused on your project that one of the most beneficial things is to step outside and gain perspective from a broader perspective. And people pay lip service to that in graduate school, especially with all the latest thing is collaboration, interdisciplinary, which sometimes is true and sometimes it's not. But to enforce, just to be forced out of your bubble, and then take a damn week somewhere else. It seems like, I don't know.
Oh, no, I think that's super valuable. And I think going further than that, there's this tendency in academic research that I have found not to be present in my work at Intrepid, is like in academia, whether it's a model, a data set, whatever your research, project is, there's this tendency to just just keep cranking on it until it's, you get a significant result, or you get a fit that is going to satisfy, your randomly selected reviewers. And really, when it just requires what the responsible thing to do is to just bail.
Yeah.
And if there was, if there were more forums for null results, you could just push it.
That's right. Right.
Push it to, some preprint server or whatever, which I think is more common now, which I think is
another thing that's
yeah. And you should always publish on a preprint server, whether or not it's the final thing, you should do that. You should publish your code. In all but some, exception cases, you should publish the data, and then, not just publish those things, but you should fully document them. And yes, I have,
we're all guilty.
A repeated offender of not having documented my code well enough. But I go through efforts to make it, easy to download, install. I include tutorials with a lot of the GitHub repos that are associated with my papers. But anyway, my point is that you should pivot. I apologize to use such a tired ass.
Oh, it's almost
Valley.
Like bringing it back from the dead. Actually, I haven't heard it in a while.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Well, I'll give pivot a reboot. But yeah, it's time to move on. But, people will spend years and years and years revamping an analysis or a story. The narrative needs to be right. And it's no, what needs to happen is this data needs to be available, or the results need to be, public, so somebody can know whether or not to run the same study, and you should move on. It's just, sometimes a week of fresh air would do the project good. I think in many cases, it's just this persistent hammering away at the same nail that had broke 4 years ago, and you should just get a new nail and hammer on that for a while.
Yeah. What's the name for when you're beating your head against the wall and then you go home in the morning and you sleep and then you wake up and you come back and you solve it immediately and it's some stupid error? Is there a name for that?
Graduate school.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, sorry.
Hey, Kyle, what are you doing these days? What's your job?
So I work in a machine learning research lab within a software company. And most of our goals center around understanding how information is represented and flows through social media networks. And so a lot of natural language processing, information retrieval, representation learning plays a big part. But yeah, it's new and fun.
What in your neuroscience background have you brought with you that is helpful, and what maybe isn't helpful? Do you have a sense of that yet? I mean, you're coding all day now, right?
Yeah, quite a bit.
Which is not that different from grad school and post,
No, but it's there are some differences. There's also some unique things, I think, about our particular lab that aren't necessarily present in all industry roles. I think because the team that I work on is very much in the experimental research and development side of things, we're not sort of patching updates and building tools that go immediately into some product that goes to market, but we're sort of exploring new tools and abilities and algorithms that could potentially fit into some of our suite of products or would be useful for some customers. And so a lot of the day-to-day stuff isn't so different from an academic setting. I think there's a clearer line that exists between, there's an easier work-life distinction where I go to work at a certain time and I come home and I'm done working.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is this weird thing that happens when you leave work. You are done, and that's nice. But yeah, so things that directly carried over. So I mentioned representation learning, which is sort of in the context of language and text data. Like, how do you find a useful representation for, let's say, a word or a collection of words, like a tweet or something, that allows you to perform computations on that representation, computations that preserve some of the meaning or its relation to other words or concepts, or where it fits in the larger space of a language.
So you're doing like natural language processing. A lot of what you're doing is that?
Yeah, almost exclusively that.
But are you using deep networks to do that, or are you using lots of different techniques?
I mean, we've there's this, I don't know why this is a trend, but like all of the state of the art, most of the state of the art natural language models are named after Sesame Street characters. So Bert and Ernie and Elmo and
I didn't realize that. I didn't put it together.
Right, yeah. So we have experimented with some of those models, and have played around with them. That is, insofar that they are neural networks related to computational neuroscience. Another, I guess, maybe less obvious neurally or biologically plausible suite of models is what are called sparse distributed representations. I think you had Francisco Weber on.
I also had Jeff Hawkins, who Francisco's business is based on the Numenta technology that Jeff Hawkins develops.
The HTM hierarchy.
Man, you know some people that know my show. Geez, thanks.
Yeah. Hey, I was a big fan. So we have found those kinds of models to be particularly useful. And one of the things you have to wrestle with in a machine learning industry role is you are in a space where, your competition is Google. And most companies don't have the compute resources, time, engineering staff to actually compete in developing like the next, BERT, right? That's just not a plausible or sort of useful goal to set out to achieve as a smaller company. So one of the things we've really focused on is how can we build efficient or interpretable models that achieve, in many cases, roughly equivalent prediction power. They're roughly as precise, maybe not always, but sometimes these really sophisticated and computationally expensive neural network models utterly fail on somewhat simple tasks. They are undeniably impressive in many ways, but if your goal is to classify the sentiment of a tweet, you can achieve that in much more efficient ways. So sparse coding models have proven to be really, really useful in some of these NLP tasks that, it was useful knowing something about how sparse coding is carried out in neural systems.
And especially in a space like the space of possibilities is vast in language. I mean, it is in many cognitive domains, but I think that the sparse distributed representations are particularly useful in that realm.
I mean, if you think about the challenge of understanding language, right? If you try to think about what
I don't
would be
like
required,
to think about it. It's too much.
No, it's too much. It is. So I didn't do any language related research before, and this has been such a sort of eye-opening, experience, getting spun up on NLP. And I work with several computational linguistic researchers who are, so I'm learning a ton. But think about just a single word, right? The orthographic representation of, let's say, the word race, right? Or bank is another common example. It just carries a ton of different meanings that, totally depend on the words adjacent to, it in a sentence. So how do you get a machine to respect the different meanings of the word race or bank based on the context? Sparse coding is, I think, Francisco Weber and the semantic folding theory also, exploits this property of sparse coding. But you can basically, build up contextually reinforced concepts for encoding a particular word, right? So you basically pay attention to what things are activated on the left and the right of this instance of the word race, and that can really pull out one of those meanings that is, very distinct from the others.
Fascinating stuff. Isn't it fun to? Also, it's probably just fun to be working on something new and different.
It is. It's so refreshing. So I get to do a ton of the same things that, really contributed to my loving, my old job.
Yeah.
And so that's been, I really feel like I re-entered that frame of mind that I had when I started my PhD program, young, bright-eyed.
Yeah, you guys don't know this, but Kyle's wearing just this super dark makeup now, and he's all goth.
Yeah. I'll also, transition to, I guess reverted back further into my scene emo stage, playing metal.
Are you playing these days?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
you never stopped playing, I guess, right?
I did. I did not play. I stopped playing guitar. I probably hadn't really played guitar in like a 3-year stretch.
Oh, that's too long. Yeah.
It was way too long. But yeah, I am playing a lot now.
Cool. Metal though?
Yeah.
Metal?
No, not always. I mean, I do like classical guitar and some jazz, some fusion.
Oh, all right.
Get pretty nerdy elevator music going on.
Cool.
Sometimes.
I have a goal to do it 30 minutes every day, and I never even pick it up. So,
Well, there's always hope tomorrow.
There's always hope tomorrow. It's on my schedule. So we, I don't want to take more of your time here. Let me just ask you some, and you can answer these quickly or go into more depth, and then I'll let you go. Because I know you got to do some more fun coding tonight, probably.
Yeah.
By the way, it's is it 11:30 now? Your time?
11:30. Yeah.
Okay, this is super late for me. It's 9:30 for me. What's one trait of our intelligence or cognition that you think is going to be really hard to build into AI?
And I think there's even been, maybe in the past month, some actual progress on this particular problem, but the problem of stringing together, forming some continuity between domains of neurointelligence, when it comes to any sort of concept or idea or experience, we can represent that thing with, any number of sensory and perceptual modalities. We can represent it by recalling memories. We can understand how the current context should influence our interpretation of that thing.
Yeah.
And so just that sort of confluence of different angles with which to represent or interpret or process, one thing, we can do each of those things in isolation right now, right?
Yeah.
With sort of human level expertise or precision or robustness, but really to string together like memory, perception, like all the different forms of perception, judgment, reason, all of those things, to get those to sort of work in concert seems like a pretty high bar. So, I think the problem is termed catastrophic forgetting in a neural network. You train it to do one thing, but if you need it to do another task, retraining it on the new task causes some, performance degradation in the first task it learned. Now there's solutions for this that, I think there's some meta reinforcement learning agents that sort of learn to hold some of the sort of pathways, the weights constant while learning the new task, and that preserves relevant learning that contributed to performance on the first one. But the ceiling on how many tasks you can cram into a neural network seems to be pretty low at this stage.
Yeah, you wouldn't want just one neural network doing it all anyway. Like you said, you want to piece things together.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable solution. Like one way is just sort of caching away the sort of the weight regime that a trained neural network, finished a task on, and then when it re-encounters something that seems similar to that, reinitializing the network to somewhere in the neighborhood of that trained regime. But yeah, I think this is a sort of research avenue that's getting really interesting. There's progressive networks or
this is Raya Hadsel's work.
Oh, no way!
People will
this
have
is
just
really
heard about it
fascinating.
because she worked on these progressive networks. But I mean, that is not brain-like at all because you're actually adding in new networks, But it's a solution. So
so this is on my reading list, but I haven't tackled it yet.
Oh yeah, well, or you could just listen to the episode before this.
I'm stoked. That's fantastic.
Anyway, so you know what I didn't mention, and I just wanted to get it in. So, are you working on Jupyter notebooks these days? What do you do with Jupyter?
So, in procrastinating on my dissertation, I was writing this package for controlling the interface for Jupyter themes, for Jupyter notebooks. Called it Jupyter themes, and much to the chagrin of one of my fellow grad students in the lab, somebody posted it on Reddit, and then that Reddit post found its way onto the front page of Hacker News, and the repo just really exploded. He had woken up to this on the front page of Hacker News and came into the lab and told me, and then I checked and it had gained several thousand stars on GitHub. But anyway, I ended up supporting it for a while. Currently, it's got somewhere upwards of 100 unresponded to bug reports. So
I see. So
it's floundered a little bit, but I am sort of off and on working on a sister project for Jupyter Lab. So, to control the sort of interface and style of the new version, the sort of, younger, fresher, cooler Jupyter interface.
This grew out of your passion for Python, I suppose.
It did. I also am a little bit particular about my syntax highlighting and interface themes. I don't know. The out of the box Jupyter notebook theme is just absolutely hideous. They did so many things that are amazing, but good God, it's your eyes would start bleeding after a full day of coding on that thing.
Yeah, well, that's why I don't do full days.
Yeah, well, that's another solution.
Okay, last question here, Kyle. So, you entered in. You were saying that the philosophy of mind got you interested in neuroscience. Yeah. Of course, I think the idea of consciousness and figuring out how it works and stuff. I think that gets a lot of people actually interested in neuroscience.
Yeah.
You lose that really quickly.
You do, yeah. It's beaten out of you.
It's beaten out of you. Yeah. Well, yeah. There's a whole little problem of facts that get in the way of and not current knowledge. But do you think that there's any hope for understanding consciousness in general? Let's just pretend like we both know what I mean when I say consciousness. Sure. And if so, is AI going to help us get there? Just understanding what it is, or is it going to come from neuroscience, or where's it going to come from?
I don't know. I think my views on this is that it's certainly not necessary for, I think we could plausibly build an AGI, an artificial general intelligence, that was truly an AGI and had no inner experience.
Yeah.
But, I don't know. It's very possible as well that it's just sort of this epiphenomenal thing that just comes with the territory of something that is capable of general intelligence. I think the question or the jury's still out on that. But I don't rule it out by any means. I do think it should be within the sort of fair game of questions to ask from a scientific perspective. And I think people have tried. It's an information theory based theory of consciousness. It's a formal theory.
Integrated information theory?
Yes, that's the one. What's the guy's name?
Giuliano.
Tononi. That's right.
Tononi.
So people have taken a stab at formalizing consciousness. I don't know if anything's really fit the bill yet. But I think it shouldn't be as taboo as it currently is in science. And maybe it is more of a philosopher's game. You could certainly approach it from a formal, computational angle in philosophy. But yeah, I mean, I think from the time of Benjamin Libet, had those really fascinating experiments that it just totally captured my imagination as an undergrad.
That there is no free will. Yeah.
There is no free will.
Yeah.
Think of that. That is crazy.
It's crazy, right?
It is just super crazy. Yeah. Anyway, I think there's certainly room in the enterprise of neuroscience for exploring deep questions like that.
He is Kyle Dunovan. You can find him on Twitter at DonovanK. And of course, I'll link to all this stuff in the show notes. Kyle, man, I could go twice as long, but it's late. And I'm happy for you that you are in a happy place. And I really enjoyed talking with you. I appreciate it, man.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. You can support the show through Patreon for a microscopic $2 or $4 per month. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. Your contribution will help sustain and improve the show and prohibit any annoying advertisements like you hear on other shows. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thanks for your support. See you next time.